spring rises out of the ground at the edge of the Jordan Valley, cold and constant, the kind of water that does not fail even in the driest month of the driest year. For thousands of years, people had walked past springs like this one, filled their water skins, and moved on following the herds and the season. At this spring, around 10,000 years ago, a group of them did something almost nobody had done before at that scale. They stayed. They built round houses of mud brick near the water, and then they did something stranger still. They raised a stone wall around the whole settlement, and inside that wall, a tower of solid stone taller than 3 men standing on each other's shoulders. Nothing forced them to build it. No enemy is recorded, no war. They built it anyway, which means they had already decided this ground was worth defending, worth returning to, worth calling theirs. That decision, repeated at rivers and springs across the Middle East over the next 6,000 years, is the whole story this episode tells. How staying turned into building, building turned into surplus, surplus turned into writing and law and kings, and how the first cities on earth set the pattern every city afterward has followed. Ain Sultan still runs today, the same spring that drew people to a low mound beside the Jordan Valley long before anyone called the place Jericho. The earliest visitors were hunters and gatherers, moving with the seasons, camping near water and moving on when the wild grain thinned out or the game grew wary. What changed sometime before 8000 BC was that a group of them stopped moving on. They built round houses of sun-dried mud brick clustered near the spring, then kept building on the same spot year after year, generation after generation, until the accumulated floors and collapsed walls formed a mound that rose above the surrounding plain. Archaeologists call this period the pre-pottery Neolithic, a label that simply means people were farming and building in permanent settlements before anyone in the region had learned to fire clay into pots. What makes Jericho remarkable is not the houses. Round mud brick huts existed at other early sites too. What makes it remarkable is the wall and the tower behind it. Sometime in this same early period, the inhabitants dug a rock-cut ditch more than 8 feet deep and built a stone wall along its inner edge, and against that wall they raised a solid stone tower nearly 30 feet tall, with an internal staircase of 22 steps climbing through its core to a flat top. No mortar bound the stones except packed mud. No machine lifted them. Every stone was carried and set by hand, by a community that had no writing to plan with and no metal tools to shape the blocks. Estimates of the labour involved run into tens of thousands of workdays, coordinated without a single surviving instruction of how that coordination happened. Historians disagree about why they built it. The oldest explanation was defence against raiders, and the wall and ditch certainly could have served that purpose. But no weapons or burned layer from an attack survived from this period, so some archaeologists now favour a different, less dramatic explanation, that the wall and tower may have held back floodwater or mudslides funneling down from the hills above the spring, or that they served as a shared civic monument, a visible symbol that this settlement, unlike a hunting camp, intended to remain exactly where it stood. Both explanations point toward the same underlying fact, whichever is closer to true. Building something this large only makes sense if the builders believed they, and their children, and their children's children, would still be living beside that spring, long enough to need it. That belief, more than the stone itself, is the hinge this whole story turns on. For nearly the entire span of human existence before this point, groups had moved with the resources they depended on. A wall says the opposite. It says the resource, in this case the spring, is worth staying, for even when staying cost enormous, sustained, collective labour that a moving band would never spend. Jericho at this stage was not yet a city by any modern definition. It had no writing, no formal ruler that the archaeological record can identify, no marketplace, no separate classes of workers doing entirely different jobs. It may have held only a few hundred people at its largest in this period, but it had the first ingredient every city that came later would need: a population willing to invest permanently in one piece of ground, and organised enough to pull off a shared project bigger than any single household could manage alone. The spring at Jericho kept running through the millennia that followed, and the settlement above it rose and fell and rebuilt itself more than 20 times across thousands of years of continuous or near-continuous habitation, one of the longest inhabited spots on the planet. Other early settlers elsewhere in the Fertile Crescent were making similar bets on similar water sources during these same centuries, without any contact with Jericho, and without knowing that a wall and a tower a few hundred miles away had already tested the same idea. The bet those separate communities were all placing, independently, was that a dependable spring or river was worth building around rather than merely visiting. Over the next several thousand years, in valleys and floodplains across the region, that bet would be placed again and again, at larger and larger scale, until the settlements built on it stopped resembling large villages and started resembling something the people living in them would eventually need an entirely new word for. Climb a ladder through a hole in a roof, cross a low mud brick ceiling on foot, then climb down another ladder into a smoky room lit only by that same roof opening, and you have arrived roughly the way a resident of Çatalhöyük arrived home every day for roughly 1,000 years. Çatalhöyük sat on the Konya Plain in what is now central Turkey, and at its peak, somewhere between 7,000 and 6,000 BC, it may have held between 5,000 and 8,000 people packed into houses built wall to wall, with no streets and no doors at ground level between them. To move through the settlement at all, people walked across an unbroken carpet of rooftops. The houses themselves were plastered smooth inside, replastered again and again over the years, sometimes dozens of layers thick, and many were painted with hunting scenes, geometric patterns, and images of leopards, vultures, and bulls. Some homes had the horned skulls of actual cattle set directly into bench platforms and walls, plaster moulded around real bone. When a resident died, the family did not carry the body away. They buried it beneath the floor of the very room they slept in, often folded into a tight crouch, sometimes with the skull removed, plastered, repainted, and kept above ground for a time before final burial. Living space and burial space were the same space. The dead stayed in the house. What Çatalhöyük appears to lack, at least according to the layers excavators have opened so far, is almost as striking as what it has. There is no palace. There is no obviously larger house that might mark a chief or a ruling family. There is no temple building set apart from ordinary homes, though nearly every home held some symbolic art, so the entire settlement functioned something like a distributed shrine rather than a place with one central one. Grave goods, tools, and house sizes vary only modestly from one household to the next, which has led many archaeologists to argue that Çatalhöyük was substantially more egalitarian than its size would suggest, though this remains debated, and some researchers point to subtler signs of emerging inequality in diet and house placement that later excavation seasons are still working through. The town supported itself mainly on farmed wheat and barley alongside sheep and goat herding, but it also sat astride something almost as valuable as grain, obsidian, the glassy black volcanic stone that flakes into an edge sharper than steel. The nearest obsidian sources were volcanic mountains in Cappadocia, a journey of many days on foot, and Çatalhöyük's residents work that stone into blades, mirrors, and ornaments that have been found at other sites hundreds of miles distant, evidence of exchange networks stretching well beyond anything the settlement needed for its own survival. A household making obsidian tools for a village a week's walk away was, in a very small way, already participating in the kind of long-distance trade that later cities would build their entire economies around. Çatalhöyük eventually declined and was abandoned, its final layers thinning out before the settlement was given up entirely, for reasons the record does not spell out clearly, perhaps changing rivers, perhaps soil exhaustion, perhaps simply the slow fraying of a way of living this dense and this improvised once alternatives appeared elsewhere. It never became a true city by later standards. It had no writing, no clear central authority, no monumental architecture set apart from domestic life. But its scale alone, thousands of people living pressed together for centuries under one continuous roofline, proved something the builders of Jericho's tower had only begun to test, that very large numbers of people actually could live crowded together permanently, without their arrangement collapsing into chaos. That proof, more than any single invention, is what the true first cities, rising a little later, and a few hundred miles to the southeast along two great rivers, would need to build on. South of the hills where Çatalhöyük's obsidian was quarried, the land flattens into a plain so level that a river crossing it can wander for miles over a single human lifetime, cutting a new channel and abandoning an old one without warning. Two rivers dominate this plain, the Tigris and the Euphrates, both fed by snowmelt from mountains far to the north, both prone to sudden, violent floods in spring that could drown a season's planting in a single night, and both capable, in the same breath, of depositing a layer of black silt across the fields so rich that a farmer working it needed almost no fallow years at all. This was the Fertile Crescent's southern floor, later called Mesopotamia, a Greek word meaning the land between the rivers, and it offered the best farmland most people in the region had ever seen, wrapped around one of the least forgiving water systems anyone had ever tried to live beside. Unlike the rain-fed hills where earlier settlements like Jericho and Çatalhöyük had grown, the southern floodplain received almost no reliable rainfall of its own. Farming here meant farming with river water on purpose, not farming despite the weather. That single fact reshaped everything about how settlements in this region had to organize themselves compared to their hillside predecessors. A village on a rain-fed slope could survive on individual household plots worked more or less independently. A village on this floodplain needed its water managed collectively, or it did not have water at all in the months the fields needed it most. One of the earliest and longest-lived of these floodplain settlements was Eridu, founded by most estimates sometime before 5400 BC, on what was then the edge of the Persian Gulf's marshes, closer to the sea than the modern ruins now sit, since the coastline itself has since retreated under thousands of years of river silt. Eridu's first buildings were modest, small shrines of mud brick built directly on the bare sand, but each shrine was rebuilt on almost precisely the same footprint as the one before it, generation after generation, growing slightly larger and more elaborate with every rebuilding, until centuries later the accumulated platform stood many feet above the original ground level. Later Sumerian tradition, recorded on tablets written well over 1,000 years after Eridu was founded, remembered it as the very first city, home to the god Enki, lord of fresh water and wisdom, and treated its temple mound as the point where kingship itself first descended from heaven to earth. Whether Eridu truly was the first true city or simply the oldest one Sumerian scribes still remembered by name, its residents were doing something their hillside predecessors had not needed to do, building a permanent religious structure that outlived any single household and rebuilding it faithfully across many human lifetimes, a form of institutional memory with no writing yet to record it in. Other villages of this same broad culture, which archaeologists now group under the label Ubaid, after a site where its pottery was first identified, spread across the southern floodplain and up into the middle reaches of the Tigris and Euphrates during these same centuries, recognizable by their distinctive greenish-painted pottery and small platform shrines. They farmed barley, which tolerates the salty soil of an irrigated floodplain better than wheat does, herded sheep and goats for wool as much as for meat, and fished the rivers and marshes for a food source that needed no planting at all. None of these villages was yet a city in any full sense. Populations remained in the hundreds or low thousands, houses stayed roughly similar in size to one another, and no clear evidence survives of kings, professional soldiers, or full-time scribes. What these Ubaid villages had discovered out of pure necessity rather than ambition was the floodplain's central trade-off. The land could feed vastly more people than any hillside village nearby, but only if its water was actively managed rather than simply received. A farmer who dug even a short ditch to carry river water 50 extra feet into a dry field had already crossed a threshold earlier hillside farmers never needed to cross, turning the landscape itself into an engineered thing, shaped on purpose to serve human need rather than merely used as found. That single ditch, repeated and extended, and eventually networked across whole districts over the following centuries, is where the next great leap toward the first true cities would begin. A single farmer with a wooden digging stick and a basket for hauling dirt can, in a few days of steady work, cut a shallow channel from a river's edge out across a field that the river's own floods do not reliably reach. It is unglamorous labour, muddy and repetitive, and the first person to try it on the Mesopotamian floodplain almost certainly left no name behind for anyone to remember. But the effect of that ditch, multiplied across a village, and then across a whole district of villages, over the centuries following the earliest Ubaid settlements, changed the floodplain's arithmetic completely. Land that could only be farmed during the weeks a natural flood happened to reach, it could now be farmed on a schedule a community controlled, planted earlier, watered more evenly, and harvested with far less risk of a dry season wiping out the crop entirely. The first channels were almost certainly small, dug and maintained by single households or small kin groups, extensions of garden plots rather than public infrastructure. But irrigation on a floodplain this flat carries an unforgiving logic that pushed cooperation past the household level almost immediately. Water taken upstream by one farmer is water no longer available to the farmer downstream, A silted channel left uncleared by one household can back up and flood a neighbour's field instead of the intended one. Managing water fairly and keeping the channels clear demanded coordination between households that had no particular reason to trust each other beyond shared need, and across the 6th and 5th millennia BC, village after village on this floodplain worked out, largely without any written record surviving to show us how, systems of shared labour and shared rules for exactly this problem. The payoff for solving it was surplus, and surplus changed what a community could afford to do with its people. A family farming rain-fed hill land at subsistence level had little room to spare a son or daughter from fieldwork for months at a time. A family farming irrigated floodplain land that reliably produced more grain than it consumed could, for the first time, support someone who spent their days doing something other than growing food, someone who made pottery full-time instead of between planting seasons, someone who wove reed baskets and mats for trade, someone who tended the shrine at the centre of the settlement and organised its offerings, someone who kept track, by whatever crude means existed before writing, of whose grain was stored where and how much of it a given household was owed back after a lean year. Storage itself became a serious architectural problem worth solving. Grain kept in an open pile rots, sprouts, or feeds rodents. Grain that a community depends on through an entire dry season or across a bad harvest year has to be kept dry, cool, and secured against both weather and theft. Excavations at several Ubaid period sites have uncovered purpose-built storage structures, sealed rooms and raised platforms clearly meant to hold communal grain rather than any single household's private stock, alongside small clay tokens, cones, spheres, and discs of baked clay whose shapes appear to correspond to specific goods and quantities. Many archaeologists, following the influential work of the researcher Denise Schmant-Besserat, believe these tokens functioned as a kind of pre-writing accounting system, one token standing for one sheep, another for one measure of grain, pressed or strung together to represent a transaction or a debt. This interpretation is not universally accepted in every detail, but the tokens themselves are real. They appear earlier than any true writing on the floodplain, and their existence tells us plainly that these communities already needed to remember quantities and obligations more precisely than memory alone could hold. By the last centuries of the Ubaid period, sometime before 4000 BC, a handful of floodplain settlements, Eridu among them, along with sites like further up the Euphrates, and a growing mound beside an ancient channel of the river that would later be called Uruk, had grown noticeably larger than their neighbours, with correspondingly larger and more elaborate temple platforms at their centre. The ditch a lone farmer once cut by hand had, by increments too gradual for any single generation to notice happening, become a network capable of feeding a settlement several times the size any rain-fed village had ever reached. The next several centuries would turn one of those larger settlements, the Mound at Uruk, into something the world had genuinely never seen before at that scale. Walk toward Uruk from any direction across the flat floodplain around 3200 BC, and you would have seen it long before you reached it, a temple mound rising out of the haze, taller and wider than anything a traveller from the hill country had ever encountered, its upper terraces decorated with thousands of small fired clay cones pressed into the mud plaster in geometric patterns of red, black and cream, catching the light like a mosaic built from 10,000 nail heads. This precinct, later remembered by its Sumerian name Iana, meaning House of Heaven, was dedicated to Inanna, goddess of love, fertility and war, and it sat at the physical and symbolic centre of a settlement that within a few centuries would outgrow every village or town anywhere on the planet before it. The scale involved is worth sitting with plainly. Estimates drawn from surveys of the site's full extent suggest that by around 3100 BC, Uruk may have covered several hundred hectares and held a population somewhere between 20 and 40,000 people. At a moment in history when a large village elsewhere might hold a few hundred, no settlement of comparable size existed anywhere else in the world at that time that archaeology has yet found. This period, roughly 4000 to 3100 BC, is now generally called the Uruk period after the city whose growth defines it, and during it, Uruk absorbed or eclipsed many of the smaller settlements around it, likely through some combination of economic pull, since a growing city with organised irrigation and temple-driven redistribution could support more people more reliably than a small independent village could, an outright depopulation of the surrounding countryside, as families relocated toward the opportunity, the larger settlement offered. What drew people to the Mound was not romance for the goddess, though her temple undeniably organized much of civic life. It was almost certainly the practical machinery the temple ran. Sumerian temples of this period functioned as enormous economic institutions in their own right, controlling large tracts of irrigated farmland, worked by dependent labourers, herding flocks numbering in the thousands, and running workshops that turned raw wool and clay into finished cloth and pottery on an industrial scale for a settlement this size. A family that gave up an independent, precarious existence on a small rain-fed or marginally irrigated plot for a place inside the temple's economic orbit was trading self-sufficiency for a kind of security no small village could offer, guaranteed rations in a bad year in exchange for labour the temple organised and directed. The physical fabric of the city grew to match its ambition. Uruk's temple architecture in this period pioneered building techniques and decorative styles, including that cone mosaic wall facing that later cities across the region would imitate for centuries. Residential quarters spread out from the temple precincts in dense clusters of mud brick housing, connected by narrow lanes, with evidence of distinct craft working districts where potters and later metal workers appear to have concentrated their workshops close together, rather than scattered evenly through the settlement, an early sign that specialized trades were beginning to cluster geographically the way trades in later cities would in dedicated market quarters. Uruk was not alone. Its rise coincided with, and likely accelerated, growth at other floodplain settlements, Kish, Lagash and Nippur among them, several of which would themselves grow into major cities within the following few centuries. But Uruk's early lead was decisive enough that its name gave the entire era its label, and Sumerian tradition centuries later would remember it as the home of legendary kings and, eventually, as the setting for the most famous story to survive from this civilization at all, the tale of a king named Gilgamesh. For now, in these early centuries, no king by that name or any name has left an unambiguous mark in the archaeological record. What had emerged instead was something almost as remarkable and considerably harder to attribute to any one person. A settlement large enough and organised enough that the old ways of remembering who owed what to whom, a handful of clay tokens counted out by hand, were about to buckle under the sheer volume of transactions a city this size generated every single day. A bevel rim bowl, as archaeologists now call it, is not an elegant object. It is roughly formed, undecorated, made quickly in an open mould rather than shaped carefully on a wheel, and it was thrown away after a single use, or at most a handful, rather than kept and treasured like the finer pottery found elsewhere at the same sites. Uruk period settlements across the floodplain have produced these crude bowls by the tens of thousands in remarkably standardized sizes, and the leading explanation for their sheer volume and their uniformity is that they were used to measure out fixed rations of grain, oil or bread to workers dependent on temple or elite households for their food. If that explanation is right, and most specialists now favour some version of it, then these unglamorous bowls are physical evidence of something enormous. A labour force in Uruk large enough and organised enough that feeding it required a standardised system rather than informal household arrangements. A labour force fed on standardised rations is, almost by definition, a labour force that has been sorted into categories. How much grain a given worker received depended on their role, their output, and very likely their status, distinctions that a small farming village, where nearly everyone did roughly the same seasonal work, had little need to draw so sharply. Uruk period cities show growing evidence of exactly this kind of sorting. Craft specialisation intensified noticeably during this period. Potters no longer simply made pots between farming tasks. Some worked full-time, using the newly invented potter's wheel to mass produce standardised vessels far faster than hand-building allowed. Metalworkers, once copper and later small amounts of other metals began arriving through trade from the surrounding mountains, formed their own specialised trade, one requiring years to master and equipment few households could afford to own privately. Temple administrators, a role that likely grew directly out of the token accounting system of the preceding centuries, managed the flow of grain, wool, and finished goods in and out of temple storehouses on a scale no single memory could track unaided. Housing itself began to reflect these divisions more visibly than it had in earlier periods. While variation in house size existed even at Ubaid period villages, Uruk period settlements show a clear emergence of larger, more elaborately built residences clustered near temple precincts, alongside denser, more modest housing further out. a pattern many archaeologists read as an early, still developing form of residential inequality, tracking access to temple resources and administrative roles rather than the older, flatter arrangements of earlier farming villages. Seal stones, small cylinders of carved stone rolled across wet clay to leave a repeating decorative impression, became common during this same period and served a genuinely new purpose, marking ownership. A merchant, an administrator, or a household head could seal a storage jar, a bundle of goods, or a clay tag attached to a shipment with their own personal design, creating a durable, hard-to-forge signature at a moment when writing did not yet exist to spell a name. The seal impression said, in effect, this belongs to someone specific, and that someone can be identified again later, which is a concept a purely communal farming village, sharing a single grain store with no need to distinguish one family's portion from another's, had far less use for. None of this happened by any single decree or invention. It emerged gradually, workshop by workshop and household by household, as a city holding tens of thousands of people simply generated more transactions, more specialized tasks, and more competing claims over stored wealth than the old informal methods of memory and mutual trust could reliably manage. The bevel rim bowl, crude and disposable as it was, marks the moment a city's food supply had become something administered rather than simply shared, and administration, once it exists, tends to need a memory sturdier than any single official's mind. That need was about to be answered by the single most consequential invention to come out of the Uruk period, one that would eventually let the pressed marks on a handful of clay tokens grow into something that could record not just quantities, but language itself. Somewhere in Uruk, close to 3300 BC, an administrator sat with a lump of soft clay and a reed cut to a wedge-shaped point, and instead of reaching for a fistful of small clay tokens the way earlier accountants had, pressed a series of marks directly into the surface of a flattened tablet. Some of the marks were simple pictures: a stylized ear of barley, a jar shape for beer, the outline of a fish. Others were more abstract, wedge-shaped impressions and circular punches representing numbers, quantities of a given good rather than the good itself drawn out in full. This tablet, and the thousands like it that have survived from Uruk and nearby sites in this same period, represent the earliest writing anyone has yet found on Earth, and it is worth being honest about what it actually says. Not poetry, not prayer, not a king's proclamation, but overwhelmingly lists, grain deliveries, herds of sheep and goats counted and assigned, beer rations allotted to named work crews. Writing, at its birth, was an accounting technology before it was anything else. The path to this invention is visible in outline in the archaeological record that preceded it. The clay tokens of the earlier Ubaid and early Uruk periods, one shape standing for one type of good, had already established the basic idea that a physical object could stand in for a quantity of something else and be counted and stored as a durable record. At some point, administrators began enclosing sets of these tokens inside hollow clay balls, sealing a specific transaction's worth of tokens together, so the count could not be tampered with after the fact. But a sealed clay ball hides its own contents, which is not especially convenient if you need to check a total without breaking the ball open, so scribes began pressing the tokens into the ball's soft outer surface before sealing it, leaving an impression of the contents visible on the outside. From there, the leap to simply pressing marks directly onto a flat tablet, skipping the tokens and the ball entirely, was a genuine invention, but not an inexplicable one. It followed a visible chain of smaller improvements, each solving a real practical problem the previous method had run into. The earliest tablets used pictographic signs, small drawings standing for the object or action they represented, alongside separate numerical notation for quantities. Over the following few centuries, these pictographs simplified and abstracted, the curved lines of a reed stylus drawn across clay, giving way to a series of straight wedge-shaped strokes pressed rather than drawn, since pressing a wedge into wet clay was faster and cleaner than trying to trace a curve. This wedge-based writing system is what modern scholars call cuneiform, from the Latin word for wedge, and over the following several centuries, as scribes and administrators kept refining it, the system gradually gained the ability to represent not just objects and numbers but the sounds of spoken Sumerian itself, allowing it eventually to record names, titles, and much later, full sentences of connected prose rather than isolated tallies. That fuller capability took generations to develop, and was still limited even by Uruk's later centuries. The earliest tablets remain overwhelmingly administrative lists. The consequences of even this limited early writing were immediate and far-reaching for the city that invented it. A temple administrator no longer had to trust memory, or the honesty of a single official, to know how much grain had been delivered by which farming district, how many sheep a given herder was responsible for, or how much beer a specific work crew had already been paid. A written tablet could be checked, referenced later, stored and, crucially, produced as evidence if a dispute arose over who owed what to whom. Writing, from its very first appearance, was a tool of institutional trust at a scale no single human memory could sustain on its own, and it belonged at this stage almost entirely to the temple and palace institutions that needed exactly that kind of trust to run a city of tens of thousands of people. The scribes who learned this new craft, likely a fairly small, specially trained class of individuals attached to temple households, held a genuinely new kind of power because of it, the power to be believed about quantities no one else present had personally witnessed. That power, once it existed, would not stay confined to grain and sheep for very long. Within a few centuries, the same wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay would begin recording something considerably more consequential than rations: the names of kings and the laws those kings claimed the right to enforce. By the final centuries of the 4th millennium BC, Uruk's temple institutions had grown wealthy and complex enough that a new kind of title starts appearing in the record, alongside the older religious title on, roughly a lord or high priest with strong ties to a city's patron deity. The newer title, Lugal, means literally big man, and over time it comes to designate something closer to what later ages would simply call a king, a figure whose authority, unlike the Ens, leaned more heavily on military leadership, on organising labour for major public works, and on defending the city physically rather than solely representing it before its gods. The two roles did not necessarily replace each other cleanly. For long stretches, cities may have had both an En and a Lugal with somewhat overlapping authority, and the exact balance of power between temple and palace shifted from city to city and century to century, in ways the surviving record only partially clarifies. What is clear is that cities on the floodplain, by the early 3rd millennium BC, were investing enormous resources in fortification, and Uruk itself is credited by later Sumerian literary tradition with building a massive defensive wall around the entire settlement, a project the later Epic of Gilgamesh attributes specifically to its legendary king. According to that epic, composed and elaborated over many centuries after the events it claims to describe, Gilgamesh built Uruk's ring wall to protect his people and to leave behind something that would outlast his own life, a monument more durable than any single reign. Whether a historical king named Gilgamesh actually existed, and if he did, whether he personally ordered this specific wall, is something historians genuinely cannot confirm from the archaeological record alone. His name appears on later king lists compiled centuries after any such ruler would have lived, and the epic itself is a work of literature composed long after, layering myth, memory, and moral lesson together in ways that resist being read as a simple historical chronicle. What the archaeology does confirm independently is that a massive city wall did exist at Uruk by around 2900 to 2700 BC, built of mud brick running for several miles around the settlement's perimeter, tall and thick enough to represent a colossal investment of labour, comparable in ambition if not in method, to Jericho's far smaller stone tower some 5,000 years earlier. The purpose this time is far less ambiguous than at Jericho. This was the beginning of a period modern scholars call the Early Dynastic period, during which multiple Sumerian cities, no longer isolated settlements each managing their own affairs in relative peace, increasingly competed and fought with one another over farmland, water rights and prestige. And a wall of this scale was, by this point, unmistakably a defensive necessity rather than an open question. The emergence of kingship and the emergence of serious warfare between cities appear tightly bound together in this period, cause and effect running in both directions. A city that faced real, sustained military threats from its neighbours had strong reason to concentrate authority in a single war leader who could organise defence quickly rather than relying on slower, more consensus-driven temple governance. And a war leader who had once secured that concentrated authority had every incentive to keep it and to pass some version of it down to a chosen successor rather than surrender it back to the temple council once the immediate crisis passed. Over the following centuries, this pattern would harden across the Sumerian city-states into something recognisably like hereditary monarchy. kings who ruled by descent rather than by temporary appointment, though the older religious legitimacy of the end title never entirely disappeared, and continued to matter for a ruler's standing well into later periods. By the time later scribes wrote down the Epic of Gilgamesh in the form that survives today, Uruk's Great Wall was already ancient, its builder already more legend than verified historical fact, and the city itself had long since passed through cycles of rivalry, conquest, and rebuilding that the wall's original builders, whoever they truly were, could not have foreseen. The wall nonetheless remembered something true, even if its attributed builder did not, that by this stage in the story of the first cities, permanence itself had become a battle. A city that could not defend its walls could not keep the surplus, the writing, or the population its temples and canals had spent centuries accumulating, and that fact was about to draw the Sumerian floodplain into an age of open warfare between its own greatest cities. The canal at the centre of the dispute had a name, the Guidon, and it ran along the border between two Sumerian cities, Lagash and Umma, marking out which fields belonged to which city's temple estates, and just as importantly, which city controlled the water flowing through that stretch of channel. Boundary canals like this one were not incidental features of the Sumerian landscape by the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. They were among the most valuable and most contested pieces of infrastructure a city-state possessed, because whoever controlled the intake point of a shared canal controlled how much water, and therefore how much grain, reached the fields downstream of it. A city that lost access to a key canal did not merely lose a border skirmish, it risked losing its harvest. Around 2450 BC, a king of Lagash named Eannatum defeated the neighbouring city of Umma in a war fought explicitly over rights to this contested canal and its surrounding farmland, and he commemorated the victory on a large carved limestone monument now known as the Stele of the Vultures, so named for the birds depicted circling above the defeated enemy's dead. The stele's inscription, one of the earliest detailed written accounts of a specific military campaign to survive from anywhere in the world, describes Eannatum's forces defeating Umma's army, imposing a treaty with sworn boundary terms, and reasserting Lagash's control over the disputed canal and its adjoining fields. Later generations of rulers from Umma appear to have disputed and reopened this same border dispute more than once over subsequent decades, a pattern of repeated conflict over the identical piece of contested water that some historians have called one of the earliest documented border wars in human history, fought, tellingly, not over abstract territory, but over the specific, life-sustaining infrastructure that made floodplain farming possible at all. This kind of conflict was not an isolated incident between two unusually quarrelsome neighbours. By the early dynastic period, the Sumerian floodplain held a whole constellation of independent city-states, Uruk, Lagash, Umma, Kish, Nippur and others, each with its own patron deity, its own king, its own temple economy, and its own network of canals feeding its own fields, and none of them subordinate to any single overarching authority for most of this era. This arrangement produced real benefits. Independent cities could adapt quickly to local conditions and did not have to wait for permission from a distant central government to manage their own irrigation or defend their own borders. But it also meant that disputes over water rights, farmland, and prestige between neighbouring cities had no higher court to settle them in, short of an appeal to the gods each city already worshipped, gods who inconveniently tended to be understood as backing their own city's claims rather than adjudicating fairly between rivals. Warfare between these cities during this period was frequent enough that fortification, already underway at Uruk, became close to universal practice across the floodplain's major settlements, and the archaeological and textual record from this period is dense with references to raids, sieges, disputed treaties, and shifting alliances between cities that, from a bird's eye view, shared essentially everything: language, religion, agricultural technique, writing system, except loyalty to a single ruler. Kish, further north, held a particular prestige during parts of this period as a city whose king was sometimes recognized by others as holding a kind of primacy or seniority among the Sumerian city-states, a status closer to first among equals than to genuine overlordship, and that prestige itself became something worth fighting to claim or to deny a rival. What this centuries-long pattern of rivalry demonstrates plainly is that the very success of the first cities, the surplus the canals produced, the population their temples supported, the permanence their walls defended, had created a new and specifically urban problem that no farming village of the preceding millennia had ever faced at this scale. Multiple large, wealthy, heavily invested population centres, each unwilling to subordinate its own interests to any neighbours, competing for a resource, river water on a flat floodplain, that could not simply be divided evenly by geography alone. That competition would continue, city against city, canal against canal, for centuries, until a force from outside the old Sumerian heartland finally imposed, by conquest rather than by consensus, the first attempt at ruling all of these fiercely independent cities under one single authority. By the later 3rd millennium BC, a Sumerian household's place in its city's economy could be read, with fair precision, off the clay tablets its transactions generated. Temple and palace archives from this period record, in painstaking administrative detail, exactly how much barley, wool or oil a given individual received as their allotted ration, and those quantities varied sharply by role and status. A senior temple administrator might receive rations many times larger than an ordinary labourer working the same institution's fields. Enslaved individuals and other dependent workers, meanwhile, appear in these same records essentially as line items, counted and rationed at the lowest tier, alongside livestock, in a genre of tablet, whose cold bureaucratic tone makes plain how thoroughly the record-keeping apparatus that writing had made possible could also be turned toward tracking and controlling human beings as property, rather than only grain and sheep. Slavery in Sumerian cities during this period took several distinct forms, not all of them permanent or hereditary in the way later, more familiar systems of chattel slavery would be. Some individuals were enslaved through capture in the wars between rival cities described in the previous chapter, becoming the spoils, quite literally, of conflicts fought over canals and borders. Others fell into debt bondage, pledging their own labour, or occasionally a family member's, against a loan they could not otherwise repay, a status that in some documented cases could eventually be worked off or bought out rather than lasting a lifetime. Free citizens, by contrast, retained rights to own property, to bring legal disputes before officials or courts, and, at least for men of sufficient standing, to participate in the kind of civic and religious life that dependent labourers and enslaved individuals were excluded from. Managing a stratified society this large and this economically interdependent, without the kind of chaos that had periodically racked rival cities over disputed resources, eventually pushed Sumerian rulers toward writing down formal law rather than relying solely on precedent, royal decree issued case by case, or a temple's own internal customs. An earlier ruler of Lagash named Uruk, reigning close to 2350 BC, is credited by his own surviving inscriptions with a set of reforms aimed at curbing abuses by powerful officials against ordinary citizens, cancelling certain debts and protecting widows and orphans from exploitative treatment, though the surviving text is closer to a royal proclamation of specific grievances addressed than a comprehensive law code covering the full range of civic and criminal matters. The oldest text that scholars generally do classify as a genuine systematic law code is attributed to Ur-Nammu, founder of a powerful dynasty ruling from the city of Ur beginning around 2100 BC, roughly 3 centuries before the far more famous and far better preserved Code of Hammurabi that a later Babylonian king would issue. The Ur-Nammu Code, known today only from later copies rather than any single complete original tablet, addresses matters including property disputes, marriage and divorce, false accusations and penalties for various offences, often prescribing specific monetary fines calibrated to the severity of the wrong, rather than the more uniformly harsh corporal punishments some later legal traditions in the region would favour. Its existence tells us that by this point Sumerian rulers saw real value, whether from genuine concern for order and fairness, or from the more calculating benefit of a ruler who could present himself as the guarantor of justice for his subjects, in having a stable, written, publicly referenced standard, rather than leaving every dispute to be settled purely at an official's individual discretion. The written tablet, invented centuries earlier to count grain and sheep for a temple that could no longer track its own resources from memory, had by this stage in the story become something considerably larger in its consequences, the medium through which an entire city's social order, who owned what, who owed what, who counted as free and who did not, could be recorded, referenced, and at least in principle, enforced consistently across an entire population, too large for any single official to know personally. That same expanding administrative reach, and the wealth it managed, made the Sumerian cities an increasingly attractive target, and eventually, an increasingly plausible foundation for something none of them had yet attempted on their own, uniting many separate, historically rival cities under one single ruler's authority. Stand anywhere on the southern Mesopotamian floodplain and look for a hillside worth quarrying, a forest worth felling, or a vein of copper ore worth digging into, and you will not find one. The entire region that grew the world's richest early grain surplus was, in almost every other resource a growing city needed, strikingly poor. No significant timber for roof beams or ship hulls, no workable stone for monumental building beyond what could be hauled a great distance, and no metal ore of any kind close enough to reach without extended travel. Every temple's cedar roof beam, every seal cutter's semi-precious stone, every bronze tool a metalworker in Uruk or ever shaped, had to come from somewhere else entirely, carried across mountains, deserts or open water, by people whose livelihood depended on exactly that gap between what the floodplain could grow in abundance and what it could not produce at all. The floodplain's answer to this scarcity was to trade its one overwhelming advantage, agricultural surplus, converted into finished textiles, pottery and grain itself, for the raw materials it lacked, and Uruk period cities pursued this trade aggressively enough to establish settlements far outside the Sumerian heartland dedicated specifically to managing it. At a site called Habuba Kabira, on the middle Euphrates in what is now Syria, archaeologists have uncovered a substantial planned settlement built in a distinctly Uruk architectural style, essentially a colony or trading outpost, established by southern Mesopotamian interests, hundreds of miles upriver from Uruk itself, likely to secure access to timber and other resources moving down from the mountains and forward the flow of goods back toward the floodplain cities. Equally important were maritime routes running the other direction, down the Euphrates and out into the Persian Gulf. Sumerian texts refer repeatedly to a place called Dilmun, generally identified by most scholars with the island of Bahrain and the adjacent Gulf coast, which served as a crucial trading hub and, for a period, may have controlled much of the flow of goods arriving by sea from further afield. Beyond Dilmun lay a still more distant land the Sumerians called Meluhar, which many specialists identify with the Indus Valley civilization, a separate and independently developed urban culture flourishing at roughly the same period across what is now Pakistan and northwest India, whose own cities, though built on different foundations and never in direct political contact with Sumer, nonetheless traded goods that eventually reached Mesopotamian markets through this maritime chain. Carnelian beads, ivory, and, most valuably of all for Mesopotamian purposes, raw copper, since the floodplain itself had none. Copper of a different origin also arrived overland and by sea from Oman, on the far side of the Gulf, where ancient mining sites confirm large-scale extraction feeding demand from Mesopotamian cities across this same broad period, and this copper, alloyed eventually with tin brought from still more distant sources, whose exact origin scholars continue to debate, gave Sumerian metalworkers the bronze that made stronger, sharper tools and weapons possible than plain copper alone could provide. Perhaps the most visually striking imported material of all was lapis lazuli, a deep blue semi-precious stone prized across the entire ancient Near East for jewelry, seals and inlaid decoration, whose only significant known ancient source lay in the mountains of Badakhshan, in what is now northeastern Afghanistan, a distance of well over 1,000 miles from the Mesopotamian cities that treasured it, carried the whole way by a relay of intermediary traders, none of whom likely knew, or needed to know, the full length of the chain their portion of the journey belonged to. This web of exchange, stretching from the mountains of Afghanistan to the shores of the Indus, and back through the Gulf to the temple workshops of Uruk and reveals something the earlier chapters of this story, focused tightly on canals, walls, and tablets within a single floodplain, could easily leave out. The first cities were never self-contained. Their surplus grain bought them materials no local resource could ever supply, and the demand that surplus created pulled distant regions into a shared economic orbit, long before any of them shared a language, a government, or even direct knowledge of one another's existence. A bead of Afghan lapis lazuli found buried in a grave at is, in its own quiet way, as clear a piece of evidence for what a city fundamentally is, a place that draws resources and people toward itself from far beyond its own fields, as any wall or tablet the floodplain ever produced on its own. A ziggurat is not, whatever its imposing silhouette might suggest to an eye trained on later Egyptian pyramids, a tomb. It is a raised platform, built in successive step terraces of mud brick, usually with a small shrine at its summit, and its purpose was not to bury a body, but to lift a temple, and the god believed to reside in it, closer to the sky than any ground-level building could manage. The tradition behind this architectural form stretches all the way back to Eridus' earliest shrine, rebuilt again and again on the same growing platform across many centuries, and by the time the third dynasty of Ur reached its height under kings like Ur-Nammu, close to 2100 BC, that same basic idea had been refined into one of the most ambitious building projects the Sumerian world had yet attempted. The Great Ziggurat of Ur, a massive stepped tower dedicated to Nanna, the moon god and patron deity of the city, its lower terrace alone covering an area larger than a football field, faced originally in fired brick set in bitumen, a naturally occurring tar the region did have local access to, over a solid core of sun-dried mud brick. The ziggurat was never simply a monument standing in isolation. It sat at the centre of a much larger temple complex that functioned as one of the single largest economic institutions in the entire city, controlling vast tracts of temple-owned farmland worked by dependent labourers, herding flocks whose wool-fed textile workshops employing hundreds of weavers, many of them women, whose finished cloth was itself a major traded commodity, and managing storage facilities holding grain, oil and dates on a scale that dwarfed anything a single wealthy household could privately maintain. The high priest or priestess overseeing a temple of this size, often a close relative of the reigning king, held genuine economic and political power in their own right, distinct from and sometimes in tension with the palace's own authority, since the temple's landholdings, labourers, and stored wealth did not automatically belong to the crown, even when the two institutions worked closely together. Religious belief and economic administration were, in this system, never fully separable ideas, the way a modern observer might instinctively want to sort them. The Sumerians understood their gods as the true owners of a city's land and resources, with the human king ruling only as a steward or representative on the god's behalf, and the temple's vast estates were, in this framework, quite literally the god's own property, farmed and managed for the deity's benefit through human intermediaries. A worker ploughing temple land was not merely working for an abstract institution, the way a modern employee might think of a corporation. They were, in the belief system that organized their entire world, working the god's own fields, and the rations they received in return were understood as a share of the god's own provision, flowing back down to the people who served that god's household. This fusion of religious cosmology and economic management gave Sumerian temples a durability few purely secular institutions of the period could match. Dynasties rose and fell, cities conquered and were conquered by rivals, kings died and were replaced, sometimes violently, but a city's principal temple and the god it served tended to persist across all of that political turbulence, rebuilt again and again on the same sacred ground, precisely because abandoning or relocating it was, in the belief system of the people who maintained it, close to unthinkable. Eridus' shrine had already demonstrated this pattern a full 2,000 years before Ur-Nammus ziggurat rose above the city of Ur, and Ur's own ziggurat would go on to be repaired and rebuilt by later rulers for well over 1,000 years after Ur-Nammus' original construction, a level of institutional continuity that the shifting fortunes of Sumerian kingship itself never came close to matching. By the time Ur-Nammus ziggurat was completed, the temple was no longer merely the origin point of Sumerian urban life. The small mud shrine that had once justified Eridus' very first act of staying in one place, but its most durable and most economically dominant institution, wealthier and longer lived than most of the kings who ruled beside it. That same king, Ur-Nammu, who commissioned this monumental temple to Nanna, was also, as the previous chapter described, responsible for compiling one of the earliest written law codes to survive. And the two projects, one a religious monument reaching toward heaven, the other a legal text reaching down into the ordinary disputes of daily civic life, reflect the same underlying ambition, to build something in Ur permanent enough and authoritative enough to outlast any single reign. Neither project, however ambitious, would prevent the era of independent, competing Sumerian city-states from ending soon afterward, not through gradual decline this time, but through conquest by a ruler from outside the old Sumerian heartland entirely. Later Mesopotamian legend, recorded on tablets composed long after the events they describe, claimed that Sargon of Akkad began life as a foundling, set adrift on a river in a basket of reeds sealed with bitumen and rescued and raised by a humble gardener, a story that should be treated as inherited legend rather than reliable biography, since it survives only in texts written centuries after Sargon's own reign and follows a folk tale pattern found attached to more than one ancient ruler's origin story across different cultures. What the more contemporary evidence, royal inscriptions and later king lists drawing on genuinely older records, does support with reasonable confidence is that Sargon rose from a relatively modest official position, likely serving an earlier king of Kish, to found his own city, Akkad, whose precise location has never been definitively identified by archaeologists despite extensive searching. And from that new base, beginning around 2334 BC by the most commonly cited traditional dating, though the exact date remains debated among specialists, he set out to conquer the independent Sumerian city-states of the southern floodplain, one after another. His inscriptions and later copies of texts attributed to him claim victories over Uruk, Lagash, Umma, and Kish itself, along with campaigns reaching well beyond the traditional Sumerian heartland into the surrounding regions. Whether every individual claim in these often self-glorifying royal inscriptions reflects precise historical fact or contains some exaggeration, as royal inscriptions across nearly every ancient civilization tend to, the broader outcome is not seriously disputed. Within Sargon's own lifetime, the fiercely independent city-states that had fought each other over boundary canals and prestige for centuries, described in an earlier chapter of this story, found themselves for the first time all answering, however unevenly, and however resentfully in many cases, to a single ruler and a single administrative centre. What Sargon and his successors built is often described by modern historians as the first empire in recorded history, a term generally reserved for a political structure that rules over multiple previously distinct peoples or city-states under one central authority, as opposed to a single city or kingdom governing only its own directly related territory. This is a meaningful distinction from everything the preceding chapters have described. Uruk's growth, however explosive, had absorbed nearby villages into a single expanding city. Sargon's conquest instead left Sumer's individual cities largely intact as physical and administrative units, their temples, their local governors, much of their existing bureaucratic apparatus, but subordinated all of them to Akkadian oversight, and crucially, to Akkadian language and administrative practice spreading alongside Sumerian in official use. Running an empire of this scale required administrative tools considerably more ambitious than any single Sumerian city had previously needed, and the Akkadian state pushed the writing system inherited from Sumer and the broader bureaucratic techniques built up over the preceding centuries for managing grain, labour and law within one city, outward across a territory spanning many formerly independent cities at once. Akkadian governors, often relatives or trusted appointees of the king rather than local hereditary rulers, were installed in conquered cities to oversee taxation and enforce loyalty to the central crown, a genuinely new layer of administration sitting above the older city-level temple and palace bureaucracies that continued operating underneath it. Standardized weights, measures, and a more unified administrative calendar appear to have spread more widely across the region during this period as well, tools that made an empire spanning multiple formerly independent economic systems easier to govern as something resembling a single coherent whole. Sargon's empire, and the dynasty he founded, did not last forever. No ancient empire of this period ever did, and the following chapter turns to how it eventually came apart. But its brief existence marked a genuine turning point in the story this entire episode has been tracing. For roughly 2,000 years before Sargon, the trajectory of this story had been about building upward, from a single springside settlement to a temple mound to a walled city to a network of rival fiercely independent cities each guarding its own canals and its own gods. Sargon's conquest for the first time bent that trajectory sideways, binding multiple already fully formed cities together under one crown, rather than growing a single city larger still. The city, invented and perfected over 2,000 years on the Mesopotamian floodplain, had just become something a wider empire could be built out of, a template other ambitious rulers across the ancient world, watching or hearing of Akkad's example, would go on to imitate for millennia afterward. Empires built quickly by conquest tend to depend heavily on the personal authority and military success of the ruler who assembled them, and the Akkadian Empire that Sargon founded proved no exception to that pattern. Within roughly a century of his death, the empire he had built faced mounting internal rebellions from cities never entirely reconciled to Akkadian rule in the first place, and, According to later Mesopotamian tradition and some corroborating evidence, mounting external pressure from a group called the Gutians, generally described in surviving sources as a people originating in the Zagros Mountains to the east, whose incursions into the Mesopotamian heartland Sumerian and Akkadian texts alike remember with considerable bitterness and likely some measure of after-the-fact exaggeration, typical of how conquered civilizations tend to describe their conquerors in retrospect. A further factor, argued by some researchers though still genuinely contested within the field, involves climate. Sediment and pollen evidence from several sites across the wider region has been interpreted by some paleoclimatologists as indicating a severe, sustained drought beginning close to 2200 BC, sometimes called the 4.2 kiloyear event, which would have struck directly at the agricultural surplus that every stage of this entire story, from the earliest irrigation ditches onward, had depended on absolutely. A prolonged drop in river flow feeding the floodplain's canal networks could have sharply reduced harvests across exactly the core agricultural districts the Akkadian state relied on to feed both its own population and the administrative and military apparatus holding its empire together at precisely the moment the apparatus was already straining under rebellion and external pressure from the Gutians. Other specialists remain skeptical that the climate evidence is strong or precisely dated enough to bear this much explanatory weight, and the honest state of the evidence is that historians and paleoclimatologists disagree about how large a role drought actually played in the Akkadian collapse relative to straightforwardly political and military causes. What is not seriously disputed is that the empire did unravel within a few generations of Sargon's death, its central authority over the old Sumerian cities crumbling even as, in many cases, the cities themselves continued on. That continuation is the detail easiest to overlook amid the story of a fallen empire, and it is also the detail most important to this whole episode's larger argument. An empire, built rapidly on conquest and centralized administration, can collapse rapidly too, its governors withdrawn or overthrown, its unified weights and calendar abandoned, its capital reduced to a name in later chronicles. A city, built slowly over many centuries on a foundation of irrigated fields, a defensible wall, a functioning temple economy, and a literate administrative class that had operated that machinery for a very long time before any empire ever arrived to rule over it, proved considerably harder to erase. Marginal settlements on the fringes of the floodplain, more dependent on the stability an empire's wider trade networks and reduced intercity warfare had temporarily provided, do appear to have been abandoned or shrunk substantially in this troubled period. But Uruk, Lagash, and several other core Sumerian cities weathered the Akkadian collapse and the subsequent decades of Gutian dominance over parts of the region, battered and reduced in influence, but never emptied of people entirely. Within roughly a century of Akkad's fall, a new native Sumerian dynasty, the third dynasty of rose to reunify much of the old Sumerian heartland under a single crown again, this time ruled by a Sumerian rather than an Akkadian-speaking royal house, though by this point the two languages and cultures had intermixed enough over the preceding generations that the distinction mattered less politically than it once had. It was under this third dynasty, and specifically under the king Ur-Nammu discussed in earlier chapters, that Ur's great ziggurat rose in its final monumental form, and the earliest fully systematic law code known to survive was compiled, both projects representing not a fresh start, built from nothing but a genuine renaissance of institutions, writing, temple administration, and legal tradition that had already existed on the floodplain for well over 1,000 years before Sargon was ever born, refined rather than reinvented after weathering the empire that had briefly ruled, and then lost its grip on the cities that outlasted it. The lesson this collapse and recovery leaves behind is not that empires are fragile, though they generally are. It is that the underlying invention this entire story has been tracing, the city itself, with its walls, its canals, and its writing, had by this point become durable enough to survive the rise and fall of the empire built on top of it, and would go on doing exactly that through every subsequent empire that would eventually rise and fall across this same floodplain in the centuries and millennia still to come. The third dynasty of itself eventually fell too, worn down by renewed external pressure and internal strain within roughly a century of Ur-Nammu's death, and after it came further waves of conquest and reorganization across the Mesopotamian floodplain, Amorite dynasties and eventually the rise of Babylon under its own famous king, Hammurabi, whose far more widely known law code, composed centuries after Ur-Nammus, drew directly and unmistakably on the same Sumerian legal and administrative traditions this entire story has traced from their earliest beginnings. Sumerian itself, as a spoken language, faded from ordinary daily use over these same centuries, gradually displaced by Akkadian and its later descendants in everyday speech. But it never fully vanished. Sumerian survived for another 1,000 years and more as a learned, ceremonial, and scholarly language, copied and studied by scribes long after ordinary Sumerian speakers themselves had disappeared, in much the same way that Latin outlived the Roman Empire that first spread it, preserved by exactly the kind of literate institution, the scribal school, that the Sumerian cities had invented in the first place to keep their own grain accounts straight. What is easiest to lose sight of, looking back across the roughly 6,000 years this whole story has now covered, from a single stone tower at a spring in the Jordan Valley to an empire spanning the length of the Mesopotamian floodplain, is how few of the pieces that made a city actually a city were invented all at once by any single genius or any single generation. The wall at Jericho solved one narrow problem for one small settlement with no writing and no metal tools to speak of. The irrigation ditch that turned Ubaid villages into places capable of feeding more people than they themselves needed, solved an entirely separate problem, centuries later and hundreds of miles away, without any awareness that a wall had once been built at all. The clay tokens that became proto-cuneiform writing solved a third problem, an administrator's inability to remember every transaction a growing temple economy generated that had nothing directly to do with either the wall or the canal. Kingship, law, temple economics, long-distance trade, and eventually empire itself were each, in turn, separate answers to separate pressures that only combined, gradually and unevenly across 2,000 years and more, into the fully formed institution later ages would simply call a city and would go on to take almost entirely for granted. The motifs running through this whole story were never symbols chosen after the fact to make a tidy narrative. They were the actual physical tools the people living through all of this reached for, again and again, because they worked. A wall, first raised in stone at Jericho, for reasons its own builders may not have fully agreed on themselves, reappears in mud brick around Uruk, defending an urban population that number in the tens of thousands, and reappears again, taller and more elaborate still, ringing city after city through the age of Sumerian rivalry, because the problem a wall solves, marking and defending the line between what a community has built and what lies beyond its control, never stopped being a problem worth solving. A channeled ribbon of river water, first dug by a single family with a digging stick and a basket, becomes the boundary canal. Two cities were willing to go to war over, because water diverted from a shared river was never merely a convenience. It was the entire difference between a floodplain that could feed 40,000 people and one that could barely feed a village, and a wedge-shaped mark pressed into wet clay, invented to remember how much grain a specific work crew had already been paid, becomes, within a few centuries, the medium for kings, laws, treaties, and the very origin stories these cities told about themselves, because once a community learns it can trust a mark more than it can trust memory alone, it does not easily give that trust back. Ur and Uruk both remained inhabited, in one reduced form or another, for well over 2,000 years after their founding, longer by a wide margin than the Akkadian Empire that briefly ruled over them, longer than the third dynasty of Ur that briefly reunified them, longer, in the end, than most of the individual kings whose names filled their own inscriptions ever imagined their own reigns would last. That single fact says something worth holding on to as this story closes. Empires rise fast and fall fast, built on the personal authority of whoever happens to be strong enough to seize it in a given generation. The city, built slowly, layer by layer, canal by canal, wall by wall, tablet by tablet, over centuries no single ruler ever lived to see the whole of, proved to be the more durable invention of the two, the one every later civilization, whatever empire happened to be ruling it at the time, kept on building more of, because nobody who has ever depended on one has found a better way to live. Every city built since has, somewhere underneath it, one of three things the first cities invented to survive: a wall to mark what is inside from what is outside, a channel to carry water where it would not naturally go, and a mark pressed into some surface to hold a memory longer than any one person's life. The wall became property lines and border fences and the locked door of an apartment. The channel became the aqueduct, the reservoir, the pipe under the street. The pressed mark became the ledger, the deed, the archive, The database that remembers what a clay tablet once remembered, who owes what to whom, and who is allowed to live where. Uruk is a low mound of eroded brick in the Iraqi desert now, its temple platform worn down to a rounded hill that goats climb. The canals that fed it silted shut a long time ago, but walk through almost any city on Earth tonight past a lit window, a locked gate, a filing cabinet in a back office holding someone's paperwork, and you are walking through the same three ideas, still working, still doing the job they were built to do at a spring in the Jordan Valley, and on a river mound in southern Iraq, long after the people who built them are only nobody has finished reading.